Greetings, viewers. My name is Jason Pooler with Feed Your Body and Mind LLC. Thanks for joining us in this plant-based nutrition course. In this lesson, we're going to discuss cardiovascular disease and its associated issues, such as stroke, heart attacks, hypertension, etc. And before we get into it, though, let me start off by introducing myself, in case you are not familiar with me. I'm Jason Pooler, a functional nutritionist with a master's in clinical nutrition. I also have a master's in natural resources. And my previous career, I worked with the U.S. Forest Service, doing a variety of activities related to environmental planning and education. My areas of focus in nutrition are in plant-based nutrition, metabolic disorders, and mindful eating. So with that, let's get to it and go to our first slide. All right, so now, number one killer of Americans, cardiovascular disease, at least before COVID-19. And a major driver of the deaths in COVID-19 we're now starting to see now that it's been over a year since the outbreak happened. Now, what most people don't realize is that this cardiovascular disease actually starts in childhood for most people, with most Americans having evidence of fatty streaks in their arteries by age 10. For many, it may even be before birth, based on studies that showed us how arteries of fetuses whose mothers had LDL cholesterol were more likely to contain arterial lesions. Now, LDL is a major culprit, though it's not the only one. Autopsies of victims show that the level of cholesterol in the blood was correlated with the degree of atherosclerosis in the arteries. One of the many lines of evidence pointing to cholesterol still being a major issue, despite what some people in the ketogenic crowds and other low-carb types want you to believe. Next slide. Now, let's look at some factors in more detail, such as trans fats, saturated fats, and yes, even dietary cholesterol. Most of the problematic chemicals can be found in processed and animal-based foods. Now, when you look at blood lipids with an eye on the progression of atherosclerosis, we can see that the actual optimal level in the blood is around 50 to 70 milligrams per deciliter. And this is determined, and we can see this in populations free of heart disease, and that's also the level where atherosclerosis progression stops in the research studies. Now, unfortunately, due to the global spread of the standard American diet filled with animal and processed foods, it's getting harder to find artery disease-free populations. So what this tells us is that even normal levels of cholesterol in the US are set at a level that is already problematic. The only dietary way to reduce LDL enough is through a whole foods plant-based diet. The research does show that it can be difficult to lower the risk on a DASH, paleo, or Mediterranean diet without medication to aid the process. This is why doctors don't really pay much attention to diet. They just don't see it. They so very rarely see people get well on their own. And when you combine this with their lack of knowledge of whole foods, plant-based diets, well, it puts us into the situation into perspective. But we do know that heart disease is reversible with diet and lifestyle changes. Based on studies done by Nathan Pritikin, Dean Ornish, and Caldwell Esselstyn, to name a few of the pioneers in this field. And others, some of these studies have been done over since the 1950s and even older, but really it's starting to come into vogue, and the research really started exploding in the last 2 decades or so. Okay, now, but we do know, but excuse me, it's well known in cardiology, likely thanks to the media attention of the documentary Super Size Me, that a single fast food meal, such as sausage and egg McMuffin, and can start to stiffen your arteries within hours. And this has been shown in studies where they took lab work to look at it. They took blood samples. They're actually looking at it. They're not just looking at things like BMI and that sort of thing. They're looking at the blood to see what's happening. So if you're eating animal protein and processed foods 3 times a day, you're damaging your arteries 3 times a day. Just as your arteries start to heal, you end up damaging them again. We have this super awesome body of ours. We are able to respond to threats. We're able to adapt, mitigate, and overcome. But when this happens day in and day out, when we're stressed out at work, stressed, have family stress at home, and then throughout the course of a day, 3 times a day, you pound your body with chemicals that are toxic in the long term and do short-term damage as well. You're really going to make it very difficult for your body to heal properly. And thus, over time, various lifestyle diseases start to develop, chief of which is the cardiovascular disease-related issues. Okay, so now let's get into it. Okay, now, and let's turn to some lesser known contributors to cardiovascular disease, such as choline, carnitine, and TMAO, which is the abbreviation of trimethylamine N oxide. Now, when carnitine or choline is metabolized by specific gut bacteria, it creates TMA, which is then metabolized by the liver to make TMAO. TMAO then goes to contribute to the progression of cardiovascular disease. Choline and carnitine are both rich in animal products. Now, interestingly, studies on vegans who have consumed a steak showed minimal production of TMAO. And this tells us that at least part of the issue is due to the impacts that animal-rich diets have on our intestinal microbiomes, since the gut flora present in those on diets high in animal foods contain the bacteria necessary to turn choline or carnitine into TMAO. This is yet one more reason to pass on animal foods when possible, and it is also a major driving force for a variety of gut issues. All right, now, go to the next slide. Okay, let's turn to a topic talked about a lot in meat-heavy circles, but seldom based on evidence: heme iron. Now let's do some myth busting. Vegetarians are no more likely to suffer from iron deficiency anemia than non-vegetarians, despite what most doctors seem to think. When they see anemia, they first ask, oh, are you vegan or vegetarian? And then they're like, well, stop that, eat your meat. No, they're not familiar with the data. They're spending too much time looking at psychopharmacology or pharmacology. So they're either trying to prescribe the antidepressants or some sort of cardiovascular disease medication, and they go to all these conferences, and very rarely do they look at the data and the evidence on dietary changes. Okay, so since eggs and dairy do not contain heme iron, studies on vegetarians are very relevant to the heme iron debate. Now, some studies show vegetarians may actually have greater iron intake. Plant foods have non-heme iron, which was thought to be less bioavailable. Now, interestingly, we are seeing that the sad result of lots of medical practitioners prescribing heme iron for women. Dietary iron intake of heme iron and body stores of heme iron are associated with coronary heart disease and stroke. Heme iron, and this is because heme iron acts as a pro-oxidant, accelerating the progression of atherosclerosis. This is not the case with non-heme iron. So let's take a deeper look. And one study looked at men who donated blood regularly, and they had a reduction in cardiovascular events compared to those who didn't donate blood regularly. And on top of this, other studies show a reduction in cancer with blood donation and an increase in cancers with blood transfusion recipients. Now, let's remember, these are in addition to the research showing non-heme iron is not associated with cardiovascular disease, while heme iron has been. So let's make sure we get that clear. You do not need to eat animal protein to get your iron. You just need to make sure you get enough iron in general. Okay, now let's shift gears as we head over to the next slide. And look at a major contributor of metabolic diseases, hypertension. Now, hypertension is the #1 risk factor for death in the world, affecting 1 in 3 adults and more than half of all people aged 60 and above. For those wondering, 110/70 is the ideal blood pressure, the one where there would be no health benefit from reducing it any lower. And this is normal for those eating healthy enough diets. Unfortunately, very few of us eat a healthy enough diet. Only those eating plant-based diets have been shown to be able to reach this level, which is part of the reason why the level was set at a higher reading. Frank Sachs, the original researcher showing how plant-based diets can reduce blood pressure in 1988, was the same Frank Sachs that helped to develop the DASH diet. And the DASH stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. The standard of care for those seeking to reduce their blood pressure using diet. Now, unfortunately, the diet allows animal-based foods and is not restrictive enough when it comes to processed foods. The diet was specifically tailored to try and get greater numbers of willing participants rather than to be tailored based on what works according to the data. This could be why so many doctors don't see very much improvement when they prescribe diet and lifestyle. Well, you have a marginal benefit in diet, and you're going to get a very marginal benefit to the disease process and in your blood work. All right, now let's turn to the most well-known cause of hypertension, sodium. Low salt diets have been proven to provide cardioprotective effects beyond just blood pressure reduction. It's been demonstrated that a single high salt meal can significantly suppress artery function within 30 minutes. And that's roughly around the time it's going to take for that food to start getting mixed up and partially digested and get sent down to the small intestine, roughly, and with variations. Among many mechanisms, such as oxidative stress, high sodium in our blood plasma also reduces the release of nitric oxide, which plays an important role in dilating our blood vessels. All right, now let's take a look at some of the major contributors to hypertension. AGEs and obesity. Now, AGEs, that's an acronym, for the term advanced glycation end products. Now, AGEs are primarily found in animal foods cooked at high temperatures or exposed to direct flame. We know that grilled meats have been found to increase the risk for hypertension. And open flame and longer temperatures lead to the greatest increases in blood pressure, which is not surprising since these methods will create the most AGEs. Okay, now another cause is probably more well known to everyone is obesity. Studies have shown that childhood obesity is linked to hypertension later in life. Those who become obese are 3 times more likely to develop hypertension compared to those who maintain a normal weight. A final driver of hypertension that we'll be discussing today is saturated fat. Protein and meat intake have been found to be correlated to blood pressure, even when controlling for other factors. Those with healthier BPs ate a diet higher in carbohydrates. This might be surprising news to those who have, done paleo, keto, or other low-carb diets. When they attempt to paint carbohydrates in a negative light, typically they fail to see the difference between carbohydrates type, mistaking the problems of high intakes of refined sugars with a problem for all carbohydrates. Now, I'll go into this in much greater detail during my talk on diabetes. For now, just know that meta-analyses have found that vegetarian diets had better blood pressure than other diets containing meat and fish. A single fatty meal has been shown to cause the heart to beat harder and for blood pressure to rise. Now, one of the ways fast food companies and a variety of industry trade groups that pump out bogus studies, one of the ways they try to make it appear as if a meal is low fat and then compare it to like a keto diet and then try not to get the result that you would expect from a low fat diet is by actually calling a diet low fat, but when you look at the actual makeup of it in the study, you see that it's not actually low in fat. That's just my dog in the background. He has his cone on his head because he's been licking off his fur. Okay, now in a study, the single fatty meal that was shown to cause the blood pressure to rise. Now in this study, the high fat in the study was 42 grams of fat. And then that's compared to a low fat control that was 1.3 grams of fat. Very different. Many of these low carb research studies will, talk a lot of smack about a low fat diet, and they'll say, "Oh, there was no benefit, no, it was very marginal, that sort of thing." But when you look at the actual amounts of fat they consider to be low, it was, about moderate to standard, and according to what most people are eating, which is, already pretty high. All right. Now, blood pressure went up 1.25 to 1.5 times higher than the low-fat meal. One thing to pay attention to in the studies funded by the animal ag industry is that they will often compare the diets in fat to a diet slightly less so, just like I said, right? So it's no surprise that they never find much of a difference between an omnivore diet and what they call a low-fat diet. And with that, I will conclude my talk today. I appreciate you taking the time to tune in and learn about some of the health implications of eating animal foods. Here's my references. And why a whole foods plant-based diet or vegan diet can help. While I didn't focus much on dairy, I will be doing so in future talks. Which is why I do not support using vegetarianism outside of it being a helpful way to transition into a more whole foods vegan diet. Now, in my next talk, I'll discuss some of the implications of animal-based studies on the incidence of diabetes. Hopefully you can tune in for that as well. Namaste. Till next time. Thank you.